Part 1, Miguel Antonio de Jesus and Diego Ortiz, Pasadena, Texas. Broad daylight in a quiet suburban street. Lawns trimmed. Driveways empty. No sign of urgency. Inside that stillness, a neighboring house stood temporarily vacant. That absence created the opening. Miguel Antonio de Jesus and Diego Ortiz entered the home with speed and purpose. Windows were broken. Rooms were searched. Valuables were gathered without hesitation. Jewelry. Cash. Small electronics. Everything that could be carried quickly was placed into a bag. The goal was efficiency, not confrontation. The house did not belong to the men watching from next door. Joe Horn stood behind his own front door. A shotgun rested in his hands. He was not surprised. He had already been on the phone. The emergency call had begun minutes earlier. He described the break-in as it happened. He narrated movements. He gave positions. He watched the property line between his yard and his neighbor's home like a boundary waiting to be crossed. The dispatcher spoke calmly. Instructions were repeated. Stay inside. Do not confront. Officers were on the way. The warnings were direct and unambiguous. The message was about safety. About distance. About waiting. Joe Horn disagreed. Throughout the call, he spoke about a law he believed protected his actions. A recent change in Texas law had expanded the circumstances under which deadly force could be used to protect property. In his mind, the situation fit that language. Burglary. Stolen goods. Suspects leaving the scene. A belief that police would not arrive in time. The dispatcher pushed back. Again and again. The risk was emphasized. The value of property was questioned. The possibility of irreversible consequences was raised. Horn listened, but his resolve hardened. Outside, Miguel Antonio de Jesus and Diego Ortiz exited the neighbor's home. The bag was full. Their pace was quick but not frantic. They stepped off the property and moved toward the street. At no point did they approach Horn's house. They did not knock. They did not shout. They did not know he was there. Horn said he was going outside. The dispatcher told him not to. The door opened. What was shouted next has never been fully agreed upon. The audio recording contained overlapping noise. Some accounts describe a warning. Others describe something shorter. What followed was clear. 3 shotgun blasts. The sound was abrupt. Final. The sequence lasted seconds. Miguel Antonio de Jesus collapsed in or near the yard. Diego Ortiz fell nearby. Both men died at the scene. The bag containing the stolen items was found close to where they fell. When officers arrived, the scene was static. Emergency responders confirmed there were no signs of life. Neither man carried a firearm. Tools used for the break-in were present. The items taken from the house were recovered. Early scrutiny focused on the direction of the shots. One officer observed that at least one of the men appeared to have been struck from behind while moving away. That detail carried weight. It raised questions about whether the men posed an immediate threat at the moment force was used. Medical examiners later stated that due to pellet spread and tissue damage, entry angles could not be conclusively determined. The forensic record did not provide a definitive answer. As identities were confirmed, more details emerged. Miguel Antonio de Jesus was not his real name. He was later identified as Hernando Riascos Torres. A Colombian national. Living under an alias. Previously deported. With a prior conviction related to narcotics trafficking. Diego Ortiz was also in the country without legal status. Those facts entered the public conversation quickly. They did not resolve it. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Protesters gathered outside Joe Horn's home. Signs accused him of vigilantism. Concerns about race and the use of force against unarmed suspects were raised. Others showed up in support. They argued that Horn had protected the neighborhood. That he had acted within the law. That the men had committed a felony and were escaping with stolen property. The emergency call recording became public. Every word was replayed. Every pause dissected. Supporters heard a man determined to stop crime. Critics heard a man ignoring repeated warnings. Law enforcement conducted a full investigation. Reports were forwarded to the Harris County District Attorney's Office. A grand jury was convened. Evidence was presented. The audio recording. Ballistics information. Officer observations. The exact wording of the Texas statute Horn referenced. Months later, the decision was announced. The grand jury declined to indict Joe Horn on any criminal charge. Prosecutors stated that while the use of deadly force is tightly limited under state law, the jury concluded Horn's actions did not constitute a criminal offense. The ruling closed the case legally. It did not close the debate. Legal scholars pointed out the complexity. The incident occurred during the day. On a neighbor's property. Not inside Horn's own home. Texas law allows deadly force in limited circumstances to prevent the escape of someone who has just committed burglary when property cannot be recovered by other means and police cannot intervene in time. Whether those conditions were truly met remained a matter of interpretation. Supporters emphasized the jury's conclusion. Critics emphasized the unanswered questions. The fact that the men were moving away. The dispatcher's warnings. The broader implications of encouraging armed intervention by private citizens. The case became a reference point in national discussions about the Castle Doctrine. About property versus life. About how much discretion the law should grant to individuals in rapidly unfolding situations. Years later, the facts remain largely undisputed. 2 men burglarized a home. They left carrying stolen property. A neighbor watched, armed himself, and went outside despite instructions not to. Shots were fired. 2 men died. A grand jury ruled the actions justified under state law. What remains unsettled is how those facts should be judged beyond the courtroom. Whether legality alone answers the moral questions. Whether the law drew the right boundary. Whether the outcome would be viewed the same under different circumstances. That unresolved tension is why this case is still discussed. Not because the timeline is unclear, but because it forces a confrontation with where the law ends and personal judgment begins. Some viewers see a man standing his ground. Others see a line crossed. Where that line should be drawn is something only you can decide, and different answers say a lot about how people view justice and responsibility. The next part moves to a basement in Minnesota, where preparation, recording devices, and silence would lead to a very different legal outcome. Part 2, Nicholas Brady and Hailey Kiefer, Little Falls, Minnesota. Thanksgiving Day settled quietly over a small Minnesota town. Streets were calm. Most homes were filled with family routines and holiday noise. One house stood apart, dark and silent. It belonged to Byron Smith. Nicholas Brady arrived first. He was young. He broke a window and climbed inside, believing the house was empty. His cousin, Hailey Kiefer, waited outside, ready to follow. Neither could see what waited below them. Byron Smith was already in the basement. He sat in a chair at the bottom of the stairs. A rifle rested across his lap. The lights were off. For weeks, he had prepared for this moment. He believed someone would return after previous thefts. He believed the law would protect him if that happened. He had arranged the space deliberately. A chair placed for comfort and stability. A firearm within reach. A recording device turned on and positioned to capture sound. He did not call the police. He did not shout a warning. He waited. Footsteps moved across the floor above. Glass had already shattered. The sound echoed through the house. Smith stayed seated. The narrow stairwell became the only path downward. When the first intruder began to descend, only the lower part of his body was visible. A shot rang out. Nicholas Brady fell onto the concrete floor. He was injured and no longer advancing. Smith rose from his chair and stepped closer. Another shot followed. Then another at close distance. Brady stopped moving. Smith dragged the body away from the base of the stairs. He placed it on a tarp and pulled it deeper into the basement. The recording device continued to capture everything. His breathing. His words. The silence that followed. Time passed. Hailey Kiefer entered the house unaware of what had already happened. She followed the same path. The same stairs. As she descended, Smith fired again. She fell on the steps. She made sounds. She did not escape. Smith approached. Another shot. Then another. When she continued to show signs of life, he fired once more at close range. The recording preserved the sequence in detail. Not just the sounds of gunfire, but Smith's commentary before and after. Afterward, he did nothing. No call for help. No call to emergency services. The bodies remained in the basement overnight. The recorder kept running, capturing hours of audio after the final shots. In the morning, Smith went to a neighbor's home. He asked for help finding a lawyer. The request raised concern. The neighbor contacted authorities. When deputies arrived, Smith was calm. He told them there were 2 deceased individuals in his basement. He led them inside. Investigators found the bodies on separate tarps. Spent casings lay on the floor. The recording device was still operating. Neither Nicholas Brady nor Hailey Kiefer had been armed. Smith told detectives he feared for his life. He said he believed the intruders might have had weapons. The physical evidence did not support that belief. The audio recording became central to the case. It documented not only the timing of the shots, but Smith's statements, his pauses, and his actions after each person was incapacitated. Prosecutors focused on intent. They argued that Smith did not react in panic. He waited. He positioned himself. He prepared equipment. He fired after the threat had ended. They emphasized the close-range shots delivered after both intruders had fallen. The dragging of the body. The pause between the 2 encounters. The decision not to seek help. Forensic analysis supported that narrative. Autopsies showed multiple wounds, including shots fired at extremely close distance while the victims were already down. The sequence of events, supported by the audio, showed controlled actions rather than split-second decisions. The defense argued self-defense under Minnesota's version of the Castle Doctrine. They claimed Smith believed his home was under attack and that fear justified his response. Prosecutors countered that the doctrine does not apply once an intruder is no longer a threat. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was decisive. Byron Smith was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and additional counts of second-degree murder. Under Minnesota law, the sentence for first-degree murder is mandatory. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Appeals followed. The defense argued that Smith had acted within his rights. The Minnesota Supreme Court rejected that argument. The justices ruled that the right to defend a home ends when the danger ends. The recordings, they stated, left no doubt that the final shots were intentional and unjustified. The case became a national reference point. Not because a homeowner defended himself, but because the line between defense and execution was crossed. Legal experts pointed out that the initial shots might have been viewed differently if nothing had followed. What defined the crime was everything that came after. Preparation. Waiting. Recording. Finishing shots. Silence. Byron Smith remains incarcerated, serving life without parole. The Little Falls case is often cited in discussions about the limits of self-defense. It illustrates how the law evaluates actions second by second, not emotions afterward. The central lesson is blunt. The moment an intruder is no longer a danger, the law expects restraint. Continuing to use force after that moment transforms a defensive act into a criminal one. Some viewers believe Smith was protecting what was his. Others see a calculated response that went far beyond protection. That difference in interpretation is what keeps this case alive in public discussion. The next part shifts from a basement prepared in silence to a rural home where an elderly woman fought back while restrained, wounded, and facing a threat she believed she would not survive. Part 3, Derek Ephraim Condon, Bingham County, Idaho. Just before dawn, when rural roads were empty and houses still asleep, Derek Ephraim Condon approached an isolated property on the edge of Bingham County. The timing was deliberate. Darkness provided cover. Distance ensured privacy. He parked his vehicle far from the home, choosing a spot where it would not be easily noticed, then continued on foot across open ground. He was prepared. The items he carried showed planning rather than impulse. Firearms. Handcuffs. Duct tape. Rope. A mask. Everything suggested control, restraint, and intent. There was no sign of confusion or hesitation in the approach. Condon forced entry through a rear door window. Glass broke quietly enough to avoid immediate attention, but not quietly enough to go unheard forever. Inside the house, Christine Janayan was asleep. She was elderly. She lived with her adult son, who had significant disabilities. Neither expected danger that morning. Christine woke to a figure standing over her bed. A flashlight. A gun pointed directly at her face. Before she could react, she was struck. Blood was later found on the bedding and the floor beside it. She was ordered out of the bedroom and guided at gunpoint into the living room. There, Condon handcuffed her wrists to a wooden chair. The demands began immediately. He wanted valuables. He wanted them quickly. Christine told him she had very little. The response was not patience. The gun was pressed against her head. The threat was clear. She eventually told him about safes located downstairs. Condon moved through the house repeatedly, searching. Each time he passed, the threats escalated. At one point, he encountered Christine's disabled son in a downstairs room. That discovery changed the tone. Prosecutors later stated that Condon became enraged. He accused Christine of lying. He warned her more than once that she was going to die. While Condon searched the basement, Christine remained handcuffed. Injured. Bleeding. Listening to footsteps above and below her. During one of his trips downstairs, she began to move. Still restrained, she dragged the chair across the carpet inch by inch. The sound was faint but steady. She pulled herself back toward her bedroom. Beneath her pillow was a revolver. A weapon she had kept there for years. Christine had experience with firearms. Earlier in her life, she had trained others in shooting sports. Investigators later said that familiarity likely made the difference. Even while handcuffed, she managed to retrieve the gun. She then dragged the chair back into the living room and concealed the weapon between a couch cushion and the armrest. Condon returned upstairs. He continued searching. He continued threatening. Christine later told investigators that at that moment she believed she would not survive. She waited. When an opening appeared, she reached for the revolver and fired. 2 shots struck Condon in the chest area. The response was immediate. Condon raised his own handgun and fired repeatedly. Bullets tore through the living room. Christine was struck multiple times. She fell to the floor, still handcuffed to the chair. Condon staggered away into the kitchen and collapsed. He died there. Christine did not move. Severely injured and losing blood, she remained on the floor for hours. Her son stayed downstairs, unaware of the full situation. Time passed slowly. Pain and shock blurred her awareness. Nearly half a day later, her son managed to bring her a phone. Only then was the emergency call made. Deputies arrived late in the morning. They found the scene exactly as described. Condon's body in the kitchen. Christine alive but critically injured in the living room. The broken rear window. Firearms. Ammunition. Duct tape. Restraints scattered throughout the house. Footprints and tire tracks leading back toward the distant parking area. Inside Condon's vehicle, investigators found additional items consistent with robbery preparation. Cash. Ammunition. Equipment. A detailed deputy report documented every element. Christine was airlifted to a regional medical center for emergency treatment. During interviews, she described the sequence as best she could. She acknowledged gaps in memory caused by head trauma and shock. Prosecutors compared her statements with the physical evidence. Nothing contradicted her account. The trajectory of bullets. The position of the chair. The location of shell casings. Everything aligned. Bingham County Prosecutor Ryan Jolly conducted a formal review. He examined the reports, forensic findings, and reconstructed timeline. His conclusion was direct. Christine Janayan's use of deadly force was justified under Idaho law. Condon's actions met every threshold. Armed entry. Physical assault. Restraint. Credible threats of death. Escalating violence. Prosecutors stated that had Condon survived, he would have faced multiple felony charges, including attempted murder, kidnapping, burglary, robbery, and aggravated battery. Instead, the case was closed as a justified act of self-defense. Jolly publicly described Christine's actions as one of the most remarkable acts of self-preservation he had ever reviewed. The case spread quickly beyond Idaho. The contrast was stark. An elderly woman. Injured. Restrained. Facing an armed intruder. Surviving only because she acted in the final moment available to her. Investigators secured the scene for days. Bullet paths were mapped. Blood patterns analyzed. No contradictory evidence emerged. The facts remained consistent from start to finish. Christine survived her injuries. Condon did not. Unlike other cases where force continued after danger ended, this incident turned on immediacy. The threat was active. The restraint was real. The intent to kill was stated. The law recognized that distinction. The file was closed with clarity. Not because the situation was simple, but because the evidence was overwhelming. Some viewers described Christine's decision as unavoidable. Others focus on how quickly a planned home invasion can collapse when a victim resists. Both perspectives exist side by side. Where responsibility lies, and how courage is defined in moments like these, is something people continue to debate in different ways. The next part moves to Oklahoma, where masked teenagers entered a home in broad daylight, and the outcome would raise questions about planning, escalation, and accountability beyond the person who pulled the trigger. Part 4, Maxwell Cook, Jacob Redden, and Jacob Woodruff, Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The decision to return was not impulsive. Earlier that same morning, 3 teenagers had already been on the property. They entered a detached garage and a recreational space, taking small items they believed were easy to move. The visit gave them confidence. It also gave them information. They believed the main house held more. By midday, they came back. Maxwell Cook, Jacob Redden, and Jacob Woodruff changed their approach. Faces covered. Gloves on. Clothing chosen to hide identity. At least 2 carried weapons intended for intimidation and resistance. This was no longer casual theft. It was an escalation. A vehicle waited nearby. Elizabeth Rodriguez sat behind the wheel. She had driven them there. She had coordinated timing. She waited while they moved toward the house. The back door was shattered. Glass broke inward. The entry was forceful and deliberate. The sound carried through the house. Inside, Zachary Peters heard it. He was home with his father. The noise was unmistakable. Peters did not go outside. He did not retreat. He armed himself with a rifle kept in the residence. His statements later described a moment measured in seconds. There was no time to assess intentions. No time to identify ages. Only masked figures moving through his home. The encounter happened in the kitchen. There was no prolonged exchange. No recorded dialogue. No negotiation. The confrontation was immediate. Peters fired a short burst. The sequence ended almost as quickly as it began. All 3 intruders were struck. 2 fell inside the house. The third made it out the door and collapsed near the property. Emergency responders later confirmed that all 3 were deceased. Peters retreated to a bedroom and made the emergency call. His voice was steady but shaken. He reported a break-in. He reported shots fired. He answered questions directly. He waited for officers to arrive. The scene was secured. Investigators documented the broken door, the masks, the weapons, and the route the intruders had taken. No injuries were found on Peters or his father. Within hours, Elizabeth Rodriguez walked into the police department. She did not flee. She did not wait to be found. She told detectives she had information about the incident. During questioning, she admitted her role. She had driven the teenagers to the property. She had waited nearby. She knew they intended to steal. She acknowledged planning elements of the break-in. Her statements changed the scope of the case. Under Oklahoma law, participation in a dangerous felony can carry responsibility for any deaths that occur during its commission. The rule does not require the participant to enter the house or use force. Planning and facilitation are enough. Rodriguez was arrested. She faced multiple counts connected to felony murder and burglary. Prosecutors argued that by driving the group, coordinating the return, and waiting during the break-in, she had set the events in motion. While her case moved forward, authorities separately reviewed Peters' actions. The district attorney's office examined everything. The forced entry. The masks. The weapons. The location inside the home. The speed of the encounter. The emergency call. The physical evidence. The analysis focused on Oklahoma's castle doctrine. That doctrine allows a homeowner to use deadly force when an intruder unlawfully and forcibly enters a residence and poses a threat. Prosecutors stated that homeowners are not required to pause and determine motives when masked and armed individuals breach their home. The conclusion was clear. Zachary Peters would not be charged. The announcement emphasized that his actions fell squarely within the protections of state law. The intruders were inside the home. They were masked. They were armed. The entry was violent. Those facts ended the legal question. Rodriguez's case ended differently. Facing the weight of the charges, she entered a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to reduced counts, including second-degree murder and burglary. The sentence was long. More than 3 decades in prison. Families of the deceased teenagers questioned the outcome. They argued the force used was excessive. They spoke about age and poor judgment. Law enforcement responded with a different focus. They pointed to the planning. The weapons. The masks. The earlier burglary. The decision to return for more. Investigators reconstructed the timeline carefully. The morning theft. The regrouping. The decision to escalate. The driver waiting nearby. Each step supported the conclusion that this was a coordinated act, not a mistake. Public reaction was divided but less ambiguous than in some other cases. Many saw the facts as straightforward. Others struggled with the finality of the outcome. 3 teenagers dead. 1 young woman imprisoned for decades. A homeowner cleared of wrongdoing. The legal lesson was precise. Inside a residence, the threshold for defensive force is lower when entry is violent and the threat is immediate. Responsibility, however, does not stop with the person who holds the weapon. Those who plan and enable can bear the consequences just as heavily. The Broken Arrow case became a reference point in Oklahoma. It is often cited when explaining how felony murder applies and how the castle doctrine functions in practice. It shows how quickly decisions made outside a house can determine what happens inside it. Nothing about the timeline is disputed. The sequence is documented through physical evidence, statements, and official findings. What remains debated is how responsibility should be weighed when planning collides with fear in a matter of seconds. Some viewers focus on the driver who never entered the house yet lost decades of her life. Others focus on the resident who had no warning beyond breaking glass. Both perspectives exist within the same set of facts. How much blame belongs to preparation, and how much belongs to the moment of confrontation, is a question that continues to divide opinion. The next part moves west to California, where an elderly homeowner followed intruders into an alley and a single decision would test the limits of fear, pursuit, and proportional response. Part 5, Andrea Miller and Gus Richard Adams, Long Beach, California. The house belonged to Thomas Greer, an elderly man living alone. The location was familiar to the intruders. Andrea Miller and Gus Richard Adams had been there before. They knew the layout. They knew Greer lived by himself. They believed he kept cash inside a safe. This was not a random target. That night, they entered through the garage area. The movement was confident. Fast. They expected the house to be empty or the owner to stay out of their way. That expectation was wrong. Thomas Greer was home. The encounter happened suddenly. As Greer moved through his own hallway, he came face to face with both intruders already inside the house. What followed was chaotic. According to later statements, Greer was pushed or thrown to the floor. He suffered injuries to his shoulder and collarbone. At his age, the impact mattered. Pain and shock set in immediately. Miller and Adams did not stop. They moved past him and focused on the safe. It was forced open. Cash was taken. The intrusion turned into a physical violation of Greer's space and body. Then they ran. They fled through the same path they had used to enter, exiting into the alley behind the property. For a moment, the house was quiet again. Greer was alone. Injured. On the floor. He believed they might come back. That belief shaped what happened next. Greer later told investigators that he feared further harm. He retrieved a revolver from inside the house. The weapon was small. A .22 caliber handgun. He moved outside. The alley was narrow. Miller and Adams were moving away. The distance between them has been described differently in various reports, but the core fact remained consistent. They were no longer inside the house. Greer fired once. The shot struck Andrea Miller. She fell in the alley. She did not get up. Emergency responders later confirmed she died at the scene. Adams kept running. He was arrested shortly afterward by officers responding to calls from nearby residents. What followed complicated the case. Greer told police and later reporters that Miller had shouted that she was pregnant. The statement spread quickly through media coverage. It added emotional weight and public reaction. The claim was later examined during the autopsy. It was not true. Miller was not pregnant. That fact did not erase the confusion of the moment, but it clarified one element. The investigation continued. Detectives documented the scene carefully. The broken entry. The damaged safe. The injuries on Greer's body. The location of the shooting in the alley. They interviewed Greer multiple times. His accounts were consistent in their central points. He described fear. He described pain. He described believing the intruders might return to finish what they started. His public remarks in the days that followed drew attention. Some statements were blunt. Some sounded angry. Critics argued that his words suggested revenge rather than fear. Supporters argued that trauma does not produce polished language. The legal question was narrower than the public debate. Under California law, prosecutors carry the burden of disproving self-defense beyond a reasonable doubt. The district attorney's office reviewed the entire file. Physical evidence. Medical findings. Witness statements. The timeline from assault to flight to the fatal shot. They examined Greer's age. His injuries. The fact that he had been overpowered inside his own home by two younger adults. They examined the fear a reasonable person in his position might experience. After review, the district attorney announced that no murder or manslaughter charges would be filed against Thomas Greer. The reasoning was direct. Prosecutors stated they could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Greer did not act out of fear for his safety. The law did not require certainty that danger would return. It required reasonable perception. Given the assault, the age disparity, and the intrusion, that threshold could not be crossed. The case against Greer was closed. Responsibility shifted to the surviving intruder. Gus Richard Adams was charged with serious felonies. First-degree burglary. First-degree robbery. Under California's felony murder principles, an accomplice can be held responsible for a death that occurs during the commission of a dangerous felony, even if that accomplice did not fire the fatal shot. Prosecutors made clear that had they pursued full felony murder charges, Adams could have faced a life sentence. Instead, a plea agreement was reached. Adams pleaded guilty to the robbery and burglary charges and received a sentence exceeding a decade in state prison. The outcome satisfied neither side completely. Some members of the public argued that firing at someone running away crossed a line. Others argued that the law must account for fear that does not end the moment an intruder turns a corner. The alley, they said, was an extension of the home in that moment. Legal analysts pointed to the gray area. California does not grant the same broad protections as some other states. Yet the standard remains focused on reasonable fear. In this case, prosecutors concluded that standard could not be disproven. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death. A single gunshot wound. No weapon found on either intruder. Evidence of the assault inside the home was consistent with Greer's account. The Long Beach case became part of a larger discussion about pursuit. When does defense end? When does retaliation begin? How much weight should age and vulnerability carry? How far can fear reasonably extend beyond a doorway? Unlike cases involving repeated shots or prolonged attacks, this incident turned on one decision. One trigger pull. One moment shaped by injury, shock, and belief. The law accepted that moment. Some viewers see the outcome as an acknowledgement of human limits under stress. Others see it as a warning about how easily fear can justify irreversible action. That tension is the lasting lesson of this case. A single shot after a break-in can carry consequences far beyond the alley where it was fired. The next part moves to a small neighborhood pharmacy, where video footage would divide a single encounter into two very different legal judgments based on what happened after the first shot. Part 6, Antoine Speedy Parker, Oklahoma City Pharmacy. Early evening in a small neighborhood pharmacy. Fluorescent lights. Shelves neatly stocked. Two teenagers entered wearing masks. Their movement was quick. Their intention was clear. This was a robbery. Antoine Speedy Parker led the way. A firearm was visible. His younger partner followed close behind, also armed. The plan was simple. Threaten the staff. Take cash and controlled medication. Leave before anyone could respond. Behind the counter, pharmacist Jerome Ursland saw them coming. The moment unfolded in seconds. As Parker moved forward, Ursland drew his handgun and fired a single shot. The round struck Parker in the head. He fell backward onto the pharmacy floor and stopped advancing. The immediate threat appeared to be over. The second teenager turned and ran out of the building. Up to that point, the response fit a familiar pattern. An armed robbery. A defender reacting to a direct and immediate danger. Investigators later acknowledged that the initial shot could be viewed as lawful self-defense under Oklahoma law. What followed changed everything. Ursland ran after the fleeing accomplice but was unable to continue the pursuit. He returned to the pharmacy less than a minute later. Parker was still on the floor. He was not standing. He was not moving toward anyone. He was unresponsive. Security cameras captured every second. Ursland stepped over Parker's body. He went behind the counter. He placed his first handgun down. He opened a drawer and retrieved a second firearm. Then he walked back toward Parker and fired multiple shots into his torso. 5 rounds. The sequence was recorded clearly. The video showed the pause. The movement. The change of weapons. The distance. There was no struggle. No attempt by Parker to rise. No visible threat. Emergency responders arrived shortly afterward. Parker was pronounced dead. The medical examiner later confirmed that while the head wound was serious, the shots to the body were the injuries that caused death. The evidence left little room for interpretation. Ursland gave interviews in the days that followed. He claimed Parker was still moving. Still a danger. Those statements were compared against the footage. Prosecutors argued they did not match what the video showed. The younger accomplice confirmed Parker had been unarmed beyond the firearm used during the robbery. No weapon was found near Parker's body after he fell. The only guns present were those brought by the teens and the 2 owned by Ursland. The investigation focused on a precise distinction. The first shot was treated separately from what followed. Prosecutors stated publicly that Ursland was not on trial for defending himself during an armed robbery. He was on trial for what he did after the danger had ended. They described the final shots as deliberate, controlled, unnecessary. Forensic analysis supported that position. Autopsy findings confirmed close-range wounds. Ballistics matched the second firearm. The timeline from the video showed no immediate provocation between the initial shot and the later rounds. At trial, the jury watched the footage repeatedly. They listened to expert testimony. They examined the sequence frame by frame. The defense argued fear, confusion, and memory distortion under stress. Prosecutors pointed to the calm movements, the pause, and the deliberate retrieval of another weapon. The jury deliberated briefly. The verdict was guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was life in prison with the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized that the conviction was based not on the initial act of defense, but on the intentional use of lethal force against a person who no longer posed a threat. Appeals followed. The defense argued issues related to memory and the placement of the second gun. Higher courts rejected those claims. Judges cited the surveillance footage as decisive. The video, they wrote, resolved any ambiguity about the sequence of events. The case became one of the most cited examples of how video evidence reshapes legal outcomes. Without the recording, the narrative might have remained disputed. With it, the law could measure action second by second, movement by movement, choice by choice. Legal analysts often return to this case to explain a core principle. Self-defense is evaluated in real time. It is not a blanket justification. The moment danger ends, the justification ends with it. The Oklahoma City pharmacy case shows how a single encounter can contain two legally different acts. One justified, one criminal. Separated not by intent claimed afterward, but by what was actually done. Jerome Ersland remains incarcerated. Antoine Speedy Parker is remembered primarily through court records and video stills. The robbery that lasted moments became a case studied for years. Some viewers believe fear does not disappear instantly. Others believe the law must draw a hard line to prevent retaliation from being framed as defense. The footage forces that debate into the open. What people take from this case often depends on which moment they focus on. The first shot. Or the final ones. The next part moves north to Montana, where preparation, surveillance, and expectation would play a central role in how a homeowner's actions were judged. Part 7, Darien Deedy, Missoula, Montana. The garage door was not fully closed. It rested open just enough to suggest carelessness. Inside, a purse sat in plain view. To someone passing by late at night, it looked like an opportunity. Darien Deedy stepped inside. He was a teenage exchange student. New to the country. Living with a host family. That night, he had been moving through neighborhoods with other teenagers, entering unlocked garages looking for alcohol. He did not know this garage was different. He did not know he was being watched. Inside the house, Marcus Karma was awake. Weeks earlier, his garage had been entered. Property had gone missing. He was angry. He talked about it openly. He told people he was tired of being targeted. Instead of securing the garage completely, he began leaving it partially open. Motion sensors were installed. A baby monitor was positioned to transmit sound from the garage into the house. The setup was deliberate. When the sensor activated, Karma saw movement on the monitor. Someone was inside the garage. He took a shotgun and stepped outside. He did not call the police. He did not shout a warning. He did not turn on the lights. He fired into the darkness. Multiple blasts were discharged in quick succession. The pattern later showed the shots moved laterally, tracking a moving figure. One round struck Deedy in the head. Another passed through his arm. He collapsed inside the garage. He had no weapon. He carried no stolen property. He had been inside only moments. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Deedy was pronounced dead at the scene. The investigation focused immediately on intent. Detectives examined the garage. The placement of the purse. The partially opened door. The monitoring equipment. They examined Karma's prior statements. Witnesses came forward. Several people recalled him saying he was staying up at night waiting for the person who kept entering his garage. Some remembered him using language that suggested anticipation rather than fear. Prosecutors built their case around preparation. They argued this was not a spontaneous reaction to an unexpected threat. They said Karma created a situation designed to attract someone. He waited. He armed himself. He fired without warning into a space where he could not see clearly who was there or what they were doing. The defense argued self-defense. They pointed to Montana law, which allows the use of force to protect an occupied structure. They argued that Karma believed another break-in was happening and that he feared the intruder could be armed. They emphasized his frustration after previous thefts and the stress of repeated violations. The jury was not persuaded. They focused on what happened before Deedy entered the garage. The surveillance setup. The staged appearance of vulnerability. The statements about waiting for someone to return. The absence of any warning. The decision to fire blindly. They concluded the force was not defensive. It was preemptive. Karma was convicted of deliberate homicide. The sentence was severe. Decades in prison, with a lengthy minimum term before any possibility of release. The judge stated that the actions were driven by anger and retribution rather than immediate fear. Appeals followed. Arguments were made about media coverage and the interpretation of self-defense law. Higher courts upheld the conviction. They wrote that the evidence supported the jury's finding of intent. For Didi's family, the loss crossed borders. His parents traveled from Germany to attend proceedings. They described a teenager who made a poor decision and never came home. For the community, the case became a warning. The law drew a clear line. Self-defense requires reaction to an immediate threat. It does not protect those who set traps, wait, and fire before a threat is established. Preparation can turn protection into provocation. Expectation can erase justification. The Missoula case is now cited whenever proactive defense is discussed. It illustrates the limits of waiting for trouble rather than responding to it. The garage was part of a home, but the actions taken there were judged by intent, not location. Some viewers believe karma was pushed too far by repeated theft. Others believe the law must prevent citizens from turning frustration into lethal action. The facts support both emotions. The verdict resolved the legal question. What remains is the uncomfortable truth that intention can be inferred from preparation, even before a single shot is fired. How far a person can go to protect property before crossing into criminal responsibility is something people continue to argue about long after the courtroom is quiet. The next part leaves the United States and moves to rural England, where an isolated farmhouse, an illegal firearm, and a fleeing intruder would ignite a national debate that lasted for years. Part 8, Fred Barris, Norfolk, England. The farmhouse stood alone among open fields. No close neighbors. No streetlights. Night arrived early and stayed heavy. Bleak House had been targeted before. Tools taken. Property damaged. Each incident deepened a sense of isolation. Anthony Martin lived there by himself. For years, he reported thefts and intrusions. He believed authorities had failed to protect him. That belief hardened into suspicion. He slept lightly. He kept a firearm nearby. The weapon was not legal. His shotgun certificate had been revoked years earlier after a separate incident, yet the gun remained in the house. Late one night, movement came from downstairs. Fred Barris and another man had forced entry through a ground floor window. They were there to steal. The house was dark. The layout unfamiliar. Upstairs, Martin was awake. He heard the sounds and took position at the top of the staircase. From that elevated point, he fired. The first blast traveled downward into the lower rooms. As the intruders realized someone was inside, they turned and tried to escape the way they had entered. Martin fired again. Then again. The pellets spread through the confined space. Fred Barris was hit as he ran. The wounds entered from behind. He collapsed outside near the window. Emergency services later confirmed he died at the scene. The other intruder was wounded but managed to flee and was later found by police. Neither intruder carried a firearm. Investigators documented the positions carefully. The staircase. The window. The angles of fire. The illegal shotgun was seized. The trajectory analysis showed shots fired while the intruders were moving away from Martin and attempting to leave the property. Under English law, the central question was not ownership or fear. It was reasonableness. The Crown Prosecution Service argued that while homeowners are allowed to defend themselves, the force used must be proportionate. Shooting a retreating intruder from a protected position exceeded that standard. The fact that Barris was struck from behind mattered. The fact that Martin fired multiple times mattered. The fact that the weapon itself was illegal mattered. At trial, the jury heard about Martin's history of victimization. They also heard about the prior revocation of his firearm license. Forensic experts described the downward angles and the timing of the shots. The prosecution emphasized that the immediate threat had passed once the intruders turned to flee. The verdict was guilty of murder. Martin received a life sentence, along with additional penalties related to the firearm and the wounding of the second intruder. The decision sparked immediate reaction across the country. Headlines framed the case as a clash between rural vulnerability and strict self-defense standards. The story did not end there. On appeal, Martin's legal team introduced psychiatric evaluations that had not been presented at trial. Specialists diagnosed him with serious mental health conditions that impaired his judgment and perception of threat. The Court of Appeal accepted that evidence. The murder conviction was reduced to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The sentence was significantly reduced. Martin served several years before being released under supervision. The legal outcome changed, but the debate intensified. Supporters argued that Martin had been abandoned by the system. A man living alone, repeatedly targeted, finally snapping under pressure. Critics argued that the law must protect life even when the person lost is committing a crime. They emphasized that running away marks a clear boundary. The case divided opinion across England. Some saw Martin as a symbol of rural frustration. Others saw the ruling as a necessary affirmation that lethal force cannot be used as punishment. Politicians weighed in. Legal commentators revisited the standards of reasonable force. The photographs, forensic reports, and appeal judgments were studied in detail. What remained constant were the facts. A remote farmhouse. An illegal gun. Shots fired from above. An intruder struck from behind while fleeing. A death that forced the courts to define the limits of fear and response. The Fred Barris case became one of the most cited self-defense cases in modern British history. It is still referenced when discussing how the law balances a homeowner's fear against an intruder's retreat. Unlike jurisdictions that grant broad latitude, English law insists on restraint once danger recedes. The farmhouse setting did not change that principle. Isolation did not erase it. Repeated theft did not override it. The appeal outcome acknowledged mental impairment, not justification. That distinction mattered. It meant the court recognized diminished capacity without endorsing the act itself. Years later, the debate continues. Was the law too harsh? Or was it the only way to prevent anger from becoming authority? The case offers no comfortable answers, only a stark line drawn by the courts. How much fear excuses force, and when that excuse must end, is something viewers still argue about whenever this case is mentioned. Many people watching will reach different conclusions based on the same facts, and that disagreement is part of why this story still resonates. In the next part, the focus shifts to Australia, where a chase into the street and a physical restraint would raise new questions about responsibility, medical uncertainty, and the limits of citizen action. Part 9, Ricky Slater, Newcastle, Australia. The intrusion happened in the early hours of the morning. The street was quiet. Inside the house, movement was not expected. Ricky Slater entered carrying a shoulder bag. Inside were knives. Drugs. Items that suggested instability rather than planning. He was under the influence. Later tests would confirm high levels of stimulants in his system. Benjamin Batram was awake in another room. When Batram realized someone was inside the house, the situation escalated immediately. Slater moved through the hallway. At some point, he entered or approached a bedroom where Batram's infant child usually slept. That detail would later weigh heavily on the case, even though the child was not present that night. Batram confronted Slater. The confrontation did not stay inside. Slater fled from the house and ran into the driveway and street area. Batram followed. What happened next unfolded in public view, under streetlights, with neighbors nearby. Batram caught up to Slater and tackled him to the ground. A struggle followed. Batram restrained Slater using a chokehold. Witnesses later described punches being thrown. They also described shouting. More than one neighbor said they yelled for Batram to stop. The restraint continued. Slater became unresponsive. Emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived quickly. Slater was taken to hospital, where he suffered multiple cardiac arrests and died the following day. The focus of the investigation shifted immediately from burglary to causation. Police confirmed Slater had broken into the home unlawfully. They confirmed the knives in his bag. They confirmed the presence of drugs. Toxicology reports later showed significant levels of methamphetamine. Medical examinations also revealed Slater had an underlying heart condition. Those findings complicated everything. Prosecutors charged Batram with murder. The case moved toward trial amid intense public debate. Some saw Batram as a father protecting his home. Others saw men who used excessive force against someone already restrained. At trial, the prosecution argued that Batram continued to apply force after Slater was no longer a threat. They pointed to witness accounts describing prolonged restraint and repeated strikes. They argued that whatever danger existed inside the house had ended once Slater fled into the street. The defense focused on context. They emphasized the armed intrusion, the presence of knives, the fear of what could have happened had Slater encountered the child. They argued Batram was attempting a lawful citizen arrest, permitted under Australian law when someone is caught committing a serious offense. Medical evidence became central. Experts testified that Slater's death was not straightforward. One specialist explained that stimulant intoxication significantly increases the risk of sudden cardiac arrest, especially during intense physical stress. Another expert described how underlying heart disease can cause collapse under conditions of restraint, panic, and exertion. The chokehold, they said, may have contributed. But it could not be identified as the sole cause of death with certainty. That uncertainty mattered. The court examined whether Batram's actions could be proven to have caused Slater's death beyond reasonable doubt. The presence of drugs, the heart condition, the exertion of flight, all introduced doubt. The jury weighed everything. They reviewed the witness statements, the medical testimony, the items found in Slater's possession, the location of the struggle outside the home, the legal boundaries of self-defense and citizen arrest. The verdict was not guilty on all charges. The court accepted that Batram had acted within the scope of lawful self-defense and citizen arrest. The judge later criticized the decision to pursue homicide charges, stating that the evidence did not support a clear causal link between Batram's actions and Slater's death. Batram was allowed to seek recovery of legal costs. The reaction was divided. Supporters argued that expecting perfect restraint from a homeowner confronting an armed intruder was unrealistic. They pointed to fear, adrenaline, and the unpredictability of drug-affected behavior. Critics argued that physical restraint carries risks and that continuing force after control is established can be fatal. The case became a reference point in Australia. It highlighted the legal concept of citizen arrest. It showed how medical uncertainty can determine criminal responsibility. It demonstrated how a case can hinge not on what was intended, but on what can be proven. Unlike cases involving firearms, this one turned on physical force and physiology. There was no video footage to define every second. Instead, the outcome rested on expert interpretation and the standard of proof. The court did not declare Batram's actions ideal. It declared them not criminal. That distinction mattered. The Slater case illustrates how the law struggles with gray zones. An intruder fleeing. A homeowner pursuing. A restraint meant to hold, not to kill. A death influenced by factors already in motion before the struggle began. Some viewers believe the verdict protects ordinary people forced into impossible decisions. Others believe it sets a dangerous precedent by excusing excessive force when medical complexity is involved. The facts allow both reactions. What remains clear is that once a confrontation moves beyond the home, the legal lens changes. Intent becomes harder to read. Responsibility becomes shared between action, condition, and circumstance. This case continues to be cited whenever citizen arrest is discussed, not because it offers certainty, but because it exposes how thin the line can be between control and catastrophe. Many people watching will have strong opinions about whether Batram should have let Slater run, or whether stopping him was unavoidable, and those reactions say as much about personal values as they do about the law. The final part moves back to the United States, where a mother confronted an intruder inside her home, children nearby, and a jury would once again be asked to decide where fear ends and legality begins. Part 10, Keandre Funches, Marietta, Georgia. The intrusion happened before sunrise, when most homes were quiet and children were still asleep. The door did not break open by force alone. Access came through another person. Someone inside. Someone trusted. That detail shaped everything that followed. Keandre Funches entered the house with the help of an accomplice who knew the residents. The home belonged to a mother living there with her children. She was awake when she heard movement. It was not the sound of a stranger hesitating. It was the sound of someone already inside. The confrontation happened quickly. According to police reports and testimony, Funches threatened the homeowner. He made statements that caused her to believe her life and her children's lives were in immediate danger. Investigators later said she believed he was armed. In that moment, the space between fear and action collapsed. She retrieved a handgun kept in the home. Shots were fired inside the residence. When officers arrived, they found Funches unresponsive. He died there. The children were physically unharmed but deeply affected by what they witnessed and heard. The house became a crime scene within minutes. The homeowner and her husband were detained for questioning. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline. Entry points. Witness statements. The position of the body. The firearm used. Everything was documented. Attention quickly shifted to the accomplice. Investigators identified the individual who had facilitated the entry. He was arrested the same day. Prosecutors alleged that he knowingly allowed an armed individual to enter an occupied home where children were present. The charges reflected that belief. Aggravated assault. False imprisonment. Charges connected to felony murder statutes for enabling the intrusion. The legal focus widened. Toxicology reports later indicated that Funches had methamphetamine in his system. Medical findings suggested underlying health issues, though those details were not made central at first. Still, they became part of the larger evaluation of causation and intent. Initially, homicide charges were pursued against the homeowner. That decision sparked immediate debate. Supporters argued she acted as any parent would when faced with a threat inside the home. Critics insisted that every use of lethal force must be scrutinized, regardless of fear. The case moved toward trial. In court, the defense emphasized context. A sudden intrusion. Children nearby. Threats perceived as real and immediate. They argued that the homeowner did not seek confrontation. She responded to it. They stressed that hesitation could have cost lives. Prosecutors focused on process. They examined statements. They examined whether the threat could be clearly established. They examined the sequence of shots. They raised questions about alternatives, even if those alternatives existed only in hindsight. Medical testimony introduced uncertainty. Experts discussed how methamphetamine use can affect perception, behavior, and physical response. They also explained that underlying health conditions can complicate determinations about cause of death. While the firearm caused the fatal injury, the broader picture resisted simple conclusions. The jury listened. They weighed fear against force. They considered the presence of children. They considered the role of the accomplice. They considered whether the homeowner's belief in imminent danger was reasonable. The verdict was not guilty on all homicide charges. The courtroom reaction was muted but intense. Relief from some. Frustration from others. The legal process continued even after the verdict. A judge later reviewed the prosecution's decision to bring the case forward. In a written ruling, the court stated that pursuing homicide charges had been unreasonable given the evidence. The ruling allowed the homeowner to seek recovery of legal costs. It was an uncommon rebuke. The accomplice's case proceeded separately. Prosecutors maintained that his actions enabled the confrontation and placed everyone inside the home at risk. His responsibility was framed not by who fired the weapon, but by who opened the door. The Marietta case closed the final chapter of this sequence for investigators. What connected it to every case before it was not geography or method. It was timing. The law returned again to the same question. When is a threat active? When does fear become reasonable? When does force cross from protection into excess? Across all these cases, the pattern remained consistent. Where danger was immediate, present, and ongoing, the law tended to recognize self-defense. Where force continued after control was established or escape had begun, courts intervened. Preparation mattered. Warnings mattered. Distance mattered. What happened after the first decisive moment mattered most of all. Some homeowners were cleared because they acted under direct threat inside their own homes. Others were convicted because they waited, pursued, or continued after the threat ended. The facts differed, but the principle did not. The Marietta case reinforced that principle one last time. A parent confronted by a perceived threat inside a home with children present occupies one of the clearest spaces the law protects. The verdict reflected that clarity. Still, not everyone agreed. Some questioned whether fear can ever justify irreversible outcomes. Others argued that expecting perfect judgment in moments of terror is unrealistic. The law does not resolve that tension. It only sets boundaries around it. This final case brought the series full circle. From Texas suburbs to Minnesota basements. From rural Idaho to urban pharmacies. From English farmhouses to Australian streets. The same line was tested again and again. The moment the threat ends is the moment the law expects force to end as well. Everything else flows from that point. Different viewers will draw different conclusions from these cases, and the way you interpret them often reveals how you weigh fear, responsibility, and restraint. If one case in this series changed how you think about self-defense more than the others, that reaction itself says something worth examining. And even though this chapter closes the timeline, the legal and moral questions behind it continue far beyond the screen.